August 2019. A gravel county road outside Miles City, Montana, 40 minutes past sundown. A rancher is driving home the way he has for 4 decades, headlights cutting through the heat still rising off the road, when something in the beam makes him stop the truck. A snake, dead, struck sometime in the last hour by the look of it, stretched across the gravel in a pattern he does not recognize. He has killed prairie rattlesnakes on this land since he was a boy. He knows the muted brown blotches, the modest 3-foot length, the sound they make before they mean it. This is not that snake. This one is longer than anything he has pulled off this road before, its back marked with dark, sharp-edged diamonds bordered in white, running down to a tail banded black and white like something out of a Texas hunting show, not a Montana pasture. He gets his phone out before the coyotes can get to it. 3 photographs, close enough to count the scales. He posts them to a regional hunting and outdoor Facebook group with a single line, "Anybody know what the hell this is?" By morning, a herpetologist 2 states away has commented under the thread. The pattern is unmistakable. That is not Crotalus viridis. That is Crotalus atrox, the western diamondback, a snake whose official range does not reach within 400 miles of where this photograph was taken. The comment gets a handful of replies, mostly disbelief, 1 or 2 jokes about global warming. Nobody from Montana Fish, Wildlife, and Parks sees it. Nobody collects the body. By the following afternoon it is gone, dragged off by scavengers or the county grader, and the only evidence that it ever existed is a phone photo buried 300 comments deep in a Facebook thread that nobody with the authority to act on it will ever read. This is where the case begins and where, in the absence of anyone looking, it also ends. Not with a conclusion, with a silence. Officially, Montana has 1 rattlesnake. The prairie rattlesnake, Crotalus viridis, is the only pit viper the state's wildlife agency recognizes as native, and it is the only one that appears on the distribution maps used by biologists, land managers, and the rural clinics that occasionally have to treat a bite. The western diamondback does not appear on those maps at all, not as rare, not as marginal, not as a species of concern. It simply is not there. The United States Geological Survey's range data for Crotalus atrox draws a boundary that runs through the desert grasslands of the Southwest, brushes the southern edge of Wyoming at its most generous extension, and stops. Below that line, the species is well documented, heavily studied, responsible for more venomous snake bites than any other snake in North America. Above it, according to every official source, there is nothing. The boundary is not arbitrary. It reflects a century of survey data, museum specimen records, and thermal tolerance research suggesting that atrox, a snake built for the low deserts of Arizona, Texas, and northern Mexico, simply cannot survive the winters 2 states north. The species needs deep, stable hibernacula to avoid freezing solid during hibernation, and its historical range has always tracked the isotherms that make that survival possible. Montana, by every model built before the last 2 decades of warming, sits outside those isotherms. The species is not endangered there. It is not even acknowledged as attempting to be there. As far as the official record is concerned, the western diamondback rattlesnake and the state of Montana have no relationship to describe. The question is not whether a diamondback can survive a Montana winter on paper. The question is whether the paper was drawn using a climate and a set of assumptions about where a species will and won't move that no longer exist. Rattlesnake range maps are not measurements taken in real time. They are historical documents, compiled from decades of accumulated specimen records, roadkill logs, and survey transects, most of them concentrated in the parts of a species range where researchers already expected to find it. Nobody surveys for diamondbacks in Montana, because the official position is that diamondbacks are not in Montana, and nobody finds evidence of a species they never went looking for. That circularity is the quiet flaw sitting underneath almost every range map in North American herpetology, and it becomes most dangerous exactly at the edges, in the transition zones where a species might be pushing into new territory faster than anyone with a clipboard is prepared to notice. Rivers change the math. The Yellowstone River and its tributary, the Powder, cut a corridor of exposed rock, south-facing bluffs, and deep sediment banks running from the Wyoming border up through southeastern Montana. precisely the kind of terrain that functions as a thermal highway for a heat-dependent reptile. South-facing riverbank slopes absorb and retain solar heat far longer into the evening than open prairie, effectively extending the useful activity window for a cold-blooded animal by hours in spring and fall, the two seasons that determine whether a snake accumulates enough body reserves to survive hibernation. The riverbanks also offer exactly the kind of deep, rocky crevice systems and abandoned mammal burrows that pit vipers rely on as hibernacula. The very feature that mainstream range models assume becomes scarce north of Wyoming. It does not become scarce along river corridors. It becomes, if anything, more available, concentrated in narrow bands that a slow-moving, heat-seeking animal could follow for miles without ever leaving favorable microhabitat. A species is not required to conquer an entire landscape to expand its range. It only has to follow the thread of habitat that already resembles home, and the Yellowstone Powder Corridor is close to a straight, unbroken thread running from confirmed diamondback territory in northeastern Wyoming directly into the ranching country around Miles City. Wyoming is not hypothetical. Border County survey work over the last 15 years has already documented atrox populations pushing measurably farther north and to higher elevations than the historical baseline described in mid-20th century herpetological surveys, tracking almost exactly with the multi-decade rise in regional winter minimum temperatures. Warmer winters mean fewer hibernating individuals freeze before spring. Fewer winter deaths mean higher effective population density at the northern edge of the range. Higher density at the edge of a range is the single most reliable predictor of dispersal pressure into unoccupied territory that exists in population ecology. Animals do not wait for an invitation to expand into marginal habitat. They get pushed into it by competition for food, denning sites, and mates back home. If the Wyoming population has been creeping north for over a decade, the Montana border is not a wall. It is simply the next available stretch of the same river corridor, 60 miles further along a path the snake has already been walking. Picture it as water finding a crack in a foundation. Nobody points to the puddle on the far side of the house and asks how the water learned to teleport. The water followed the lowest, easiest path available to it, 1 degree of gravity at a time, until it reached a place a survey never expected to find it. A range edge behaves the same way under pressure. It does not leap. It seeps 1 generation and 1 river mile at a time, until the population sitting at what used to be the boundary is no longer the same population the boundary was drawn around. If you have made it this far, you already understand why this case matters more than a curiosity about snake geography. This channel exists to sit with exactly this kind of gap, the space between what the official record says and what the physical evidence is quietly suggesting. So if that's the kind of investigation you want more of, subscribe. This is the case science hasn't closed yet, and it is not the only one. The Miles City carcass is not an isolated data point once it is set against the pattern building around it. Rural clinics in eastern Montana have for years occasionally logged rattlesnake envenomations described in intake notes as unusually severe for Crotalus viridis, bites producing swelling, tissue necrosis, and coagulopathy, more consistent with the higher venom yield of a larger pit viper than with the comparatively modest bite of a prairie rattlesnake. Because Montana clinicians are trained to expect exactly 1 rattlesnake species, these cases are treated, charted, and closed as prairie rattlesnake bites of unusual severity, variation attributed to bite location, patient physiology, or simple bad luck, never to species. There is no diagnostic protocol in the state that asks a treating physician to consider whether the animal responsible might not be the animal the map says it should be. A misidentified species does not announce itself in an emergency room. It simply produces an outlier the record has no other box to put it in. Outdoor and hunting forums across eastern Montana carry the same low hum of unconfirmed reports, photographs too blurry to verify, descriptions of bigger, meaner-looking rattlers along river bottoms, second-hand accounts of snakes that didn't look right, dismissed as exaggeration or misremembering. Individually, each of these reports is worthless as evidence. A blurry photograph proves nothing. A rancher's 50-year memory of what a prairie rattlesnake looks like is not infallible. But evidence accumulates in weight, not in certainty, and a body of scattered independent low-confidence reports converging on the same physical description, in the same river corridor, over the same 10-year window, is not the same thing as noise. It is the shape a range expansion makes before anyone with the authority to formally document it has bothered to look. Not enough to confirm, not enough to dismiss. The physical case for plausibility does not rest on the accumulation of anecdote alone. Museum and university reptile collections across the northern Great Plains hold decades of preserved rattlesnake specimens, most of them logged simply as Crotalus viridis at the time of collection, identified in the field by collectors who, like the rural clinicians, had no institutional reason to consider an alternative. Pit viper taxonomy at the specimen level depends on close comparison of blotch shape, scale counts, and tail banding, features that are trivial to conflate under a quick field identification, especially in juvenile or intermediate pattern individuals, and especially when the identifier has already been told, by every reference source available to them, that only one species is possible in that county. A misidentified specimen does not correct itself, sitting in a jar. It simply waits for someone with a reason to look twice. That reason exists in the biology of the genus itself. Crotalus atrox and Crotalus viridis are closely related pit vipers with overlapping ranges across large stretches of the southern Great Plains, and hybridization between closely related Crotalus species, while uncommon, is a documented phenomenon in zones where their ranges meet. A hybrid individual would not present as a clean diamondback. It would present as something in between, a prairie rattlesnake with unusually bold blotch definition, or a diamondback with a prairie rattlesnake's more subdued base coloration. Exactly the kind of ambiguous animal a field observer would default to calling an odd-looking prairie rattlesnake, rather than flag as evidence of something new. If hybridization has been occurring quietly along the southern edge of Montana's rattlesnake range for a generation or more, the population would not look like an invasion. It would look like ordinary local variation, right up until someone ran the genetics. It was not lost. That is the shape this kind of gap always takes. In every case this channel has traced. The animal is not hiding in some impossible, undiscovered wilderness. It is walking along a river corridor that already has a name on every map in the state, moving through a population that field biologists drive past on their way to survey somewhere else. It is not lost. It is simply not being looked for, and a species that nobody is looking for can occupy a landscape for a decade without producing a single piece of evidence that meets the formal bar for confirmation. That is precisely the objection a skeptic is right to raise. If a larger, more dangerous pit viper has genuinely been expanding into Montana for over a decade, where is the specimen? Where is the live capture? The confirmed photograph taken by a state biologist, the genetic sample logged in a peer-reviewed database? The absence of a captured, verified individual is a real gap, and it deserves a real answer rather than a dismissal. And part of it is simple decomposition. A snake killed on a gravel road at dusk in August does not survive as evidence for more than a day in a landscape with coyotes, magpies, and heat. The Miles City animal was not lost to bureaucratic indifference alone. It was lost to the ordinary physics of a carcass in the open, the same physics that erases the vast majority of roadkill evidence for any species before a biologist ever has the chance to reach it. A live capture requires someone to be in the right stretch of riverbank at the right hour, with the right training to recognize what they are looking at, in a region where the people most likely to encounter the animal are ranchers and hunters, not herpetologists. The absence of a captured specimen is not proof of absence. It is proof of a monitoring system built for a landscape that no longer exists. None of this proves the western diamondback rattlesnake has established a breeding population in Montana. It cannot prove that, and it would be dishonest to claim otherwise. What it proves is narrower, and in its way, more unsettling. That the current official record is not equipped to tell the difference between a species that truly isn't there, and a species that is there, but has never been looked for correctly. Every piece of this case, the river corridor's thermal geography, the confirmed Wyoming border expansion, the outlier clinical bites, the ambiguous museum specimens, the possibility of quiet hybridization, points the same direction without any single piece being sufficient on its own. That is not proof. It is the exact texture of a range shift caught mid-motion before the paperwork has caught up to the animal. Somewhere along the Yellowstone or the Powder tonight, something is moving through the cooling riverbank rock in the last of the day's stored heat. hunting the way it has for millions of years, indifferent to which side of a USGS polygon it happens to be standing on. It may be a prairie rattlesnake, exactly as the map insists it must be. It may not be. Nobody is out there tonight to check, and nobody was out there in August of 2019, when a rancher's headlights caught a pattern of diamonds on a gravel road that, according to every official record in the state of Montana, should not have been there at all. The photograph still exists, buried in a comment thread. The body does not. And the gap between what the map says and what was actually lying on that road, however briefly in the dark, remains exactly where it was left, open, undocumented, and waiting for someone with the authority to finally go and look.